Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We'll give folks a minute or so to trickle in. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I am delighted that you've chosen to spend some time with me. We'll give folks a moment or so to trickle in. Hi, Becky. Hi, Tish. Thanks for joining us. And if you feel comfortable, please feel free to share where you're zooming in from tonight. Oh, Janine, I'm so glad you can be here. Janine, you really definitely inspired the first part of this program tonight. So you're on my mind. Charleston, South Carolina, lots of folks from Massachusetts, Seattle. Dee, I've seen your name before. Thanks for being here. New York City, Furlong, Pennsylvania, Indianapolis. This is so great. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day. This will be a really fun little romp through the history of art. We've got a lot of people checking in, which I absolutely love. And I do copy and paste the whole chat so I can sort of enjoy it after the fact. So thank you, everybody, for kind of checking in. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. My name is Jane Oneail. I am the company Culturally Curious. I specialize in putting together art appreciation programs like this one. And I am just, like I said, absolutely delighted and humbled that you are spending your evening with me. And it seems like we have this incredible representation from around the country. So again, thank you for being here. And thank you to the Chelmsford Library, the Amesbury Public Library, the Tewksbury Public Library, and the Groton Public Library for working together to help present this program. Now, if you've been to one of my programs before, you probably already know how we usually do this. It's usually about an hour-long lecture. You can put things in the chat along the way, and I'll circle back for questions in the Q&A and in the chat at the end of the program. What I will say about this program is that it's a little bit different. All of my programs are, art history based and usually about, sort of vigorous research about the artists and their works. And there is plenty of research in tonight's program, but the focus is a little bit different. The focus is fashion. Tonight is art history's best dressed. And it sort of feels like a high school yearbook superlative. It's kind of meaningless, but a lot of fun and so much eye candy tonight. So you might be learning some new fashion terms along the way. I know I did in doing the research for this. So sit back, relax. I hope you're wearing your absolute best. I curled my hair for this. So, so we are going to dive right in. And I have a wonderful friend and volunteer in Chelmsford who helped to kind of brainstorm this program with me several months back. And she helped me realize there's so many different ways to approach this subject. And I kind of just wanted to acknowledge them because they're all kind of fun in their own right. We're looking at an image, of course, of Madonna, and she's wearing a skirt that was painted by the graffiti artist turned pop artist Keith Haring. This was 1984, and we can see some of Keith Haring's familiar dancing figures down here and these kind of glyphs that he's so well known for. So there's one idea of art actually being transcribed onto fashion, sort of related to that. You have fashion that is very closely inspired by famous works of art. So here's a Mondrian dress that was designed by Yves Saint Laurent in 1965. Other fashion designers use a looser interpretation. Sometimes they look at a famous work of art, like something by Gustav Klimt, like we see over here on the left, and they might use the gold and the decorative patterning here to create a beautiful evening gown, like Alexander McQueen did in 2013. So there's all different ways to slice this. And speaking of Alexander McQueen, I think it's worth acknowledging that the exhibition of his work, Savage Beauty, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art back in 2011 was really a boundary-breaking show in so many ways, because fashion was exhibited in the same kind of spaces where art was exhibited. And this show broke attendance records. People went wild over Alexander McQueen's Savage Beauty exhibition. And more recently, of course, here in Boston, people kind of went crazy over the Fashioned by Sargent exhibit, where we could see Sargent's beautiful paintings right alongside the dresses of the beautiful people that wore them. So I think there's this sense that we can't get enough of this fascinating connection between the world of fashion and the world of fine art. And I'll just draw this out just a little bit more, because we now have this extended fascination with specific artists too. So when we think of somebody like Georgia O'Keeffe, who we can see on the left over here, oftentimes her works are exhibited in galleries right alongside her clothing. So we think of her sartorial choices as being an extension of her artistic choices. And so these things go hand in hand, and you can see a nice sort of visual correlation there. There's, I think, a similar fascination with the artist Frida Kahlo, where people are so intrigued by the identity that she fashioned for herself and the major role that clothes played in her life, that there are simply touring exhibitions just of her clothes. They don't need to be exhibited alongside her artwork, and people flock to those exhibitions. This is a gallery installation shot from a show that's called Looks Can Be Deceiving. So we have this sense of this fairly newfound link, a very strong link, and newfound fascination between artists, fashion, paintings. They all kind of come together in a wonderful program for tonight, which I'm sure you'll enjoy. So let me give you a sense in terms of how I put this program together. I initially thought of just zooming in on particular pieces of clothing, like hats or boots or something like that, but I had to make it a little bit more broad so we could see some nice variety. So we're starting off with some stunning silhouettes. We're going to turn our attention to hats and headwear, and then we're kind of going to get into textures and materials. And with each subsequent section here, we're kind of removing a layer of clothing too, so getting a little more intimate over the course of the evening. Now, we're not going to see Mrs. Carl Meyer over here again for the rest of the night. So I wanted to just kind of give you a wonderful peek at one of the details of her gorgeous dress. And of course, this is a painting by John Singer Sargent from just before the turn of the century. We can see her here in this gorgeous silk dress with all the chiffon along the top, this big black bold sash at her waist. And you can probably see that there are some pearls kind of tucked in, like a double strand of pearls tucked into the sash. But the detail that I love here, and I'm going to sort of clumsily zoom in for you, is that those pearls extend all the way down her lap to her shoes. Can you imagine trying to walk around with a strand of pearls like that? So, so we have just our first glimpse now of like an overstated fashion statement. So we're going to be seeing plenty more of that as we turn our attention to some stunning silhouettes. And this is a great reminder that fashion can be all about power. We are, of course, looking at two examples of paintings from Hans Holbein the Younger, and they are both portrayals of King Henry VIII from the year 1540. The one on the right is really from the workshop of Holbein. Now, in both of these pictures, the stance of the subject, and certainly what he is wearing, is there to underscore just how powerful and significant Henry VIII was. And he was also sort of obsessed with fashion too. He was the kind of king that would create sumptuary laws banning other people from wearing the kinds of things that he wanted to wear. I mean, certainly he was the type of person that had access to the best materials, to the best clothing makers, but he didn't want anyone to rival him in any way. So he actually created a law that said nobody else could wear the color purple, this royal color that we're seeing. And he actually outlawed these square-toed shoes that we see over on the right if they were wider than 6 inches. So he had to be making the boldest statement, and he certainly seems to be with this jacket here, this very wide-shouldered gown that he's wearing. Now, the important thing to remember here is that we're kind of coming out of a little ice age in Northern Europe at this time. So we can see that there's this emphasis on a lot of layers, this fur-lined kind of robe that he has on. And then in both of these paintings, you can see that he's wearing bold sleeves. Sleeves are all the rage, and these are what are called slashed sleeves. It's an intentional opening in the sleeves and even in the rest of the shirt itself, where you can see through the material, and he's sort of puffed up the white shirt that's underneath it. So if you're going to be wearing a lot of layers, it's almost like you want them exposed. You want to reveal the fact that you've got all these sumptuous layers on. Now, it's only the first slide of this program, really, and we're already getting into cod pieces. We have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, right? So interestingly, cod pieces sort of started off as like this extra piece of fabric that would kind of unify the legs of two hose that you would put on, that would be disconnected and you would put on separately and attach together. And over the years, it became something that was padded, that was shaped, that would intentionally draw your eye to the genitalia instead of disguising it. And we can see it's like the perfect kind of punctuation mark for an already outsized outfit, like the one that we see here. Now, not to be outdone, we're going to be looking at King Henry VIII's rival of the day, maybe his frenemy, more like it. This is Francois I, who's painted by the French artist Jean Clouet in 1530. And once again, this is a stunning silhouette. The sleeves are huge. His shirt cannot be contained by the wooden panel that he is painted on. And so we can see a slightly different take on this kind of puffed, slashed sleeve that we saw before. Instead, these are just open seams. It's almost like he's wearing ribbons of clothing that are just pinned together here and there. But once again, the emphasis is on revealing that there's another layer underneath and kind of puffing it out. Notice too, the way Clouet has kind of suggested the sheen of silk and satin here. We'll be talking a lot more about that along the way. And finally, I just love this very shrewd expression that Jean Clouet has painted on Francois I. You can tell this is a man who does not want to be outdone in any way, but I just have to acknowledge there was actually a meeting between Henry VIII, Francois I, where they did try to kind of outdo each other. There were jousts, there were performances, and both of these kings had golden tents that you can see in this painting from 1545. Golden tents, silk tents with golden thread in them. You can see Henry VIII down below approaching these tents. This was an event that came to be known as the Field of Cloth. The Field of Gold. And so we have this notion that textiles are ultimately about power here. Sorry, I mispronounced it. It was the Field of Gold cloth. Okay, so we have this notion, like I said, that textiles play this huge role in conveying power, and it's really all about outsized forms. So if we move forward just a little bit into the 1580s, the 1590s, we have another English monarch here, Elizabeth I, and once again, an absolutely stunning silhouette. I'm not sure about you, but my eyes go right to these huge puffed sleeves here. These are known as leg of mutton sleeves. You can see that they go out and up and they are very puffy, and then they taper right down to the wrist here. And it creates the look of, once again, very large arms. Notice too that the queen is wearing a very tight bodice here, which shapes her slender form and actually makes her torso look about as wide, if not skinnier, than her actual arms. So once again, a sort of a dazzling silhouette here once you add this big bell-shaped skirt as well. Now, Elizabeth, being very savvy here, has many other allusions to power, whether it's the Armada in the background, her hand on the globe in the foreground, standing on an actual map of Europe over here on the left. There's so much more we could mention with these two images, but for now, we'll just leave it at the giant sleeves. We'll be seeing plenty of collars and bedazzled dresses along the way. We're moving again through history, through time now. And this is a little girl who you might recognize. This is the Infanta Margarita Teresa, painted by the Spanish Baroque artist Diego Velázquez in 1659. She's about 8 years old here. And you might recognize her because Velázquez's most famous painting is one called Las Meninas. And this little girl, the Infanta in the foreground, is the same little girl that we're examining over here on the right. And I'll just keep these two images up. The Las Meninas, the ladies in waiting that we see over on the left, is a very complicated image. We could probably spend an hour just in and of itself decoding this image, but we see a number of young women and a few little people who are wearing a similar style dress to what we see on the right. So this was a very wide ensemble, right? This poor little girl looks like she can't even reach the outer edges of her skirt. And we can see that, that it was a dominant style, that all of these people are wearing it. So here she is in a dress that's really designed to contour this very striking silhouette here with all of this, with all of these striped lines here that draw your attention to the width of this dress. Now, this style of dress was known as a guardaenfante. And you can see that it emphasizes the hips and it also projects out just a little bit here. Now, the term guardaenfante apparently came from the fact that there was a belief that some women would hide their pregnancies wearing a full skirt like this. It would, I imagine that would still be pretty hard to do, but men in particular mocked this style of dress. They referred to it as being, like they called it like a bell or a turtle dress. And believe it or not, people tried to outlaw this style of dress in 1639. And it kind of didn't work. It actually only made the style more popular. So, so even though it doesn't look like the most comfortable outfit to wear, or even something that you could easily move around in, people continue to wear this. The extremely rich and powerful continue to wear this for quite some time. And that brings us to our next, oh, this keeps happening in my Zooms for some reason. I just double checked this. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for 1 second. And usually this gets solved if I just open and close my PowerPoint once again. I'm not sure why I keep having this hiccup. I apologize. Let's try this out. Such a strange thing. Okay. Back here, share the screen, and here we go. So this brings us to our next stunning silhouette. And this is, of course, Marie Antoinette. If you've been to my programs before, you've probably seen this dress before. This is a court dress. This was the type of thing that you would have to wear if you're going to any sort of official event at the Palace Versailles. Marie Antoinette was painted in 1778 by the artist Vigée Lebrun. And the queen is just 22 years old here, rocking out her best possible outfit. And we can see the emphasis here is really, once again, on these very wide hips. It would be very difficult to get through a door wearing a dress like this. And I really long for the days where women could style themselves in just such a big, oversized way. So we can see multiple swags of drapery here. We see these golden tassels. We see a lace stomacher here and ruffles along the sleeves, but it's really that the shape here. The particular type of corset that was used to support a dress like this was known as a pannier, which essentially referred to the kind of wicker baskets that would hang over either side of a mule or pack animal that's like loading your stuff. So once again, people were sort of making fun of these dresses, but ultimately they were seen as almost like declarations of women's liberation, if you can imagine that, these hard to move around in dresses. Now, what made them liberating for women is that women, number one, were literally taking up space with dresses like this. They were occupying the space that, you know, three men might be occupying. And furthermore, they were a dress like this could help prevent men from just haphazardly brushing up against women. So they had a little bit more freedom that way. And ultimately, some women really embraced this style. But our next stunning silhouette could not be more different. We are turning our attention now to, you have to include her, right? John Singer Sargent's Madame X. Now, this was painted in 1884 by a very young artist. He was just 28 years old when he painted the 25-year-old Parisian socialite that we see here, Madame Gautreau. And here she is wearing this stunning black bodice here. This is velvet, and we can see that it comes down to this sort of dramatic point here, a sweetheart neckline with these jeweled straps here. And then this is a full satin skirt that probably has a bustle in the back. So it's really emphasizing this tiny little waist that this woman has. We've got this striking contrast between the black dress and her very, very pale white skin here. And now she is all curves. This is va 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 voom, of course, right? But believe it or not, there was actually some contemporary criticism when this painting was first displayed about exactly how that bodice fit. There was a sense that it wasn't kind of close enough to her flesh. But the biggest concern, of course, was the strap of that dress. And I'm sure all of you at this point have heard the story of how John Singer Sargent had originally painted the strap of Madame X's dress falling over her shoulder. And ultimately, there was such an outcry over this over-the-top sensuality here that John Singer Sargent was essentially shamed into repainting that strap so that it's sort of securely on her shoulder there. Now, there was kind of like this erotic tinge to this picture that people found kind of crude, kind of crass. A contemporary critic wrote, "One more struggle and the lady will be free." This sense that the dress was just going to fall right off of her, which of course could never happen. The straps of the dress were purely ornamental. She was wearing what was almost certainly like a metal or whalebone corset that would have been very difficult to take on and off. So the strap was repainted, and Sargent's reputation, as we all know, was ultimately repaired. Now, I have one more stunning silhouette to share with you before we move on to our next section. And it's from a painting which I haven't had the pleasure of sharing with you yet. This is Georges Seurat's masterpiece, Sunday on La Grande Jatte, which was painted between 1884 and 1886. This is at the Art Institute of Chicago. It's known for its striking beauty, its grand scale. It's about 10 feet wide, 7 feet tall, and of course, its very important cameo in the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So we are looking at a scene of leisure. This was a park just on the edge of Paris where people would go and spend their free time and relax and maybe even do some swimming, some boating. This woman over here is fishing. Maybe you'll even bring out your little pet monkey, right? But this is our focus today is on this very tall woman here on the right. That is one heck of a stunning silhouette, is it not? Now, most art historians would agree, or I should say there's some scholarship out there that asserts that this woman that we're looking at here is or was what was known as a demi-mondaine, which was like a courtesan at the time, but it was the type of courtesan that would have a wealthy patron who would actually take this woman out and kind of spoil her. Demi-mondaines had a really important role in Paris society, where they often served as inspiration for creative types. In this case, even Georges Seurat. But oftentimes they were also showcasing the latest fashions. And in this case, that is exactly what this woman is doing here with this very striking bustle that she's wearing. So you can see through various studies and sketches that Georges Seurat did over the course of the 3 to 4 years that he's painting this, that the woman's rear end, that the size of this bustle gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is, of course, painted in this pointillist technique, which is kind of related to French Impressionism, but instead it's really controlled. Imagine making a 7 by 10 foot painting where every single square inch of the painting, even the frame, is just a single little dot of color. It's like making it out of pixels. And it almost seems like he just added layer upon layer of bustle to this woman's dress. As it turns out, by the year that this was done, the bustle had reached the very height of fashion. And at that point, a critic at the time described the size of the bustle as being good enough sized, essentially, that a tea tray might be carried upon it. And interestingly, this is also the year that the bustle went bust. After this point in time, nobody was wearing them anymore, and an entirely different silhouette came into fashion. And I'm sure women were so grateful for that, because I'm not sure how easy it was to sit down in a bustle like this. Okay, so let's turn our attention now to some hats and headwear. And I've just pulled what I think are some really striking examples from the history of art for us to consider. So we are looking at a portrait of a lady by the artist van der Weyden from 1460. This is at the National Gallery of Art. And of course, the focus here is this thin, crisp, delicate veil that this young woman is wearing. And in the 15th century, veils were usually used to for modesty purposes. You know, it's like you're trying to cover up. But in this case, this veil is just there to highlight this young woman's distinctive beauty. So we can see that she has a relatively hairless face. I don't see any eyelashes, maybe just the suggestion of eyebrows. And it looks as though she has fashionably plucked her hairline back and has pulled the rest of her hair up into what's called a turret and covered up with this little patchwork netting that's called a crispin. Now, the crispin has been pinned into place with these 2 pins very carefully, where and that is where the veil is also attached. So the veil then unfolds, then spreads over her shoulders, creating this very distinctive composition here, this very distinctive form within the composition, I should say. And I just love the vague sense of the translucency of this veil, as well as the folds that are still evident there. It's such a delicately rendered item. And again, it sort of steals the show in a painting like this one. Okay, we're going to turn our attention now to one of the best. A little bit of a preview for next month too, when we do Rembrandt and Vermeer. This is one of Rembrandt's earliest portraits. It's of a man who for a long time was just described as his favorite model, but may have actually been Rembrandt's father. It's called Old Man with the Gold Chain from 1631. This is also at the Chicago Art Institute. Now, here's a good reminder to us that Rembrandt was painting around the time that the Pilgrims came to America. And so we see a real emphasis on Black clothing. And it seems so puritanical, right? But it's also a reminder to us that it was also very expensive. It was expensive to dye your clothes pure black like this. So this was also a statement of wealth and sophistication to a certain degree. So we've got Rembrandt essentially showing off for future clients all of these textures that he could so beautifully render in his paintings, from the gold chain to the gorget, to the pearl earring. But look at the shape of this Renaissance styled hat here. It's a little bit out of fashion for the Baroque, but it's such a striking form, this undulating line. It reminds me of some kind of sea creature kind of perched on his head here, creating this shadow across the eyes of his subject, so that you have to peer in a little bit closer to get a sense of who he is, the texture of his flesh too. And then it's all capped off with these two plumes here, creating this kind of perfect pyramidal composition, even though his subject is in a rather complicated pose here, turned to one side, neck craned, and looking towards the other side. But I think in the end, it's the shape of this beautiful undulating line, this beautiful Renaissance hat here, which kind of steals the show. Now, our next painting is a double portrait and also a self-portrait. The artist here is the Flemish Baroque artist, Peter Paul Rubens. And he was kind of painting the best moment of his life. He had just come back from a long stint in Italy. His career was on the rise, and he is actually, he's met the love of his life. He's about to be engaged to this beautiful young woman that we see here. Her name was Isabella Brandt. So not only are they doing well financially, but they are in love. And that is, that's why this picture is oftentimes called the honeysuckle bower, which is this arbor behind them. Honeysuckle is known as a symbol of everlasting love. But it's the clothes, right, that kind of make the whole picture. It's like the nouveau rich, and they're kind of showing it off. He's actually wearing orange hose here, but it's the hats too. There's so much confidence in wearing the hats. This picture has been cut down over the years, so he actually had a taller hat. We can't quite see the whole thing, but it's a black hat that looks like it has a piece of jewelry, maybe not quite a buckle at the top of it. And her hat here, I think, sort of steals the show. It's a very tall hat. It's probably a straw hat known as a sugarloaf or a capotane. And we can see that it's kind of pinned up on one side, and it almost looks as though she's wearing a lace French hood underneath it. So we've got like two pieces of headwear for the price of one. In the end, I just had to include this work because the two of them looking out at us with all this confidence because of this very ostentatious clothing selection for both of them, I think I think it just nails this notion of the importance of hats to a great outfit. So the next piece of fashionable headwear I wanted to share with you is the powdered wig, a very different kind of piece of headwear, right? The portrait here is of Charles de France. He was the Duc de Berry, and he was painted by Nicolas de Largillière. And our subject here is actually the grandson of Louis XIV. This was painted around 1710. What a wig, right? Now, the origin stories for powdered wigs kind of differ, but they usually all kind of go back to a monarch who was balding or prematurely losing his hair. And so he starts wearing a wig, and then all of the nobility around him starts wearing a wig too. Now, these wigs were oftentimes made out of human hair, so they would quickly get oily or sort of start to smell. And so you would need to powder them. And the powder was usually flour or dried clay. So sometimes these wigs could weigh like 2 pounds because there's so much powder in them. And members of the nobility, if they were to go out at night, they would have to have a personal valet who would oftentimes have to powder their wig multiple times in the evening. So this particular style that we see in this painting, where the hair is very tall and then we have this dramatic part in the middle, this was of a very certain time because it was right around the year 1700 that wigs started to have that central part and to get very, very tall. Commoners began wearing wigs, and so to not be outdone, members of the nobility, the aristocracy, their wigs would get bigger and bigger and bigger. Yes, indeed, Marie Antoinette would wear wigs occasionally that were like 3 feet tall. And to this day, people with power and authority, we still refer to them as bigwigs. So it's a fascinating little piece of headwear. And the last piece of headwear, the last hat we're going to consider for this evening is one doozy of a hat. This is Lady Georgiana Cavendish, painted by Thomas Gainsborough in 1785. She was the great, great, great grand aunt of Princess Diana, and she had sort of a similarly tragic marriage where her husband was not at all interested in spending time with her. So she poured herself into society. She was a really important person in social circles, very influential, very stylish. So when she went to have her portrait painted by Thomas Gainsborough, she herself designed this enormous hat to wear in the portrait. And it works in a couple of different ways. First of all, it doesn't smush or outshine this big head of hair that she has, right? The hairstyle stands on its own. I could do a whole other program just on fashionable hair. But it also, when worn at this kind of jaunty angle, we can see that it creates this wonderful silhouette of her face too. It focuses our attention on her face and on her beauty, so much so that Gainsborough's other subjects wanted to wear similar hats. And this style of hat came to be known as a Gainsborough hat or a portrait hat or a picture hat. So Cavendish here was quite the trendsetter, and we see the trend happening right before our very eyes. It might look silly to us today, but it certainly worked back in the late 1700s. All right, so now we're going to turn our attention to velvet and fur. And whenever I think of velvet and fur, my mind goes right back to one of the oldies and the goodies, the Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck from 1434. Now, we know that the couple portrayed here, well, at least the man, Arnolfini, he was a merchant, and he traded in fur and, well, I should say cloth and other luxury goods. We can see here that he's got quite a hat himself, right? But he's wearing a fur-lined cloak. I want to draw your attention instead to this unbelievable outfit that this woman is wearing. And of course, this is one of the most talked about outfits in the history of art because everyone always assumes that she is pregnant. One of the shifting styles of the time, of course, was just that a swollen belly was a fashionable look. So she's wearing a blue dress. You can see the sleeves here in the bottom of that blue dress at the bottom. This green garment is known as a houppelande. And we can see that it is fur lined. She's got this beautiful white fur that is acting as trim around the sleeves, around the neckline, and then all along the hem as well. We can imagine how much green fabric is involved here because it's just pooling here at her feet. Now, the openings for the sleeves of her houppelande are very large. And as we zoom in here a little bit, we can see that there's this decorative patterning at the bottom that circles around the back of the garment and connects to the bottom of the other sleeve here. That's what's called dagging. It's sort of like using pinking shears or scissors today to create a little decorative patterning. So you can imagine like how much cutting had to be done in order to achieve that particular design work there. So so when we think of this as being like an outstanding statement of luxury goods and fur in particular, we know that this woman is really dressed to the nines. Now, I could go into what he's wearing, but I think an even better portrayal of a fur-lined garment is this one here. We're going back to Rembrandt for just a moment, another very early portrait. And in this case, we know the subject. His name was Nicholas Rutz, painted in 1631. This is at the Frick collection. And what an outfit, right? Look at this fur-lined gown that he's wearing. This is what's known as a tabard. It was a little bit out of style at the time of the painting, but it's an article of clothing that's kind of associated with being learned. It's associated with tradition. And the way that Rembrandt was able to suggest the sheen of the fur here is just really astonishing to me. Now, this would have been sable lined, and a sable is like a little weasel type creature with thick, warm fur. Would have taken a lot of sables in order to line a garment like this. Incidentally, sable fur was also used to create paintbrushes too. Now, sables were not native to Europe. They had to be caught in Russia and Asia and Mongolia and imported in order to make garments like this. So what do you think this guy did? That was exactly his job. He was a merchant. He was a fur trader with Russia, which is an explanation for his fur-lined Ushanka hat here. And the description of his wealth, of the clothing that a man like this could provide is truly just second to none in Rembrandt's portrayal here. Now, we're going to move on to another fur-lined garment by one of Rembrandt's contemporaries, Johannes Vermeer. And so we have two works here. On the left, a lady writing from 1665, and on the right, lady with a maidservant holding a letter from about 2 years later. This one's at the Frick, this one's at the National Gallery of Art. And in Vermeer's very small body of work, about 35 paintings total, 6 of them feature this yellow jacket that we're looking at here. This is a satin morning jacket with ermine trim and possibly ermine lining here. So we can see the trim, of course, all around the edges here and at the cuffs. Now, ermine are also these little weasels, and they have this very striking white winter fur with a little brown tipped tail. So it would take a lot of ermine fur in order to create a lining, which is why we typically associate ermine-lined garments with royalty, right? Usually kings are depicted with ermine-lined capes and drapery and that sort of thing. So as we look at these two coats that Vermeer painted, they almost are certainly the same coat, even though the yellow seems a little bit different from picture to picture. If you look at the spots, they are generally in the same places. And in fact, when Vermeer's, after his death, there was an inventory of his possessions, and one of the objects in the possession of his household was a yellow fur-lined coat, just like the one that we see here. Now, that tells us sort of a sad secret about this coat, because if it was owned by an artist, almost certainly this is not ermine fur. And so our sad secret here is that those little black dots of fur on these fur-lined coats are probably cat or mouse fur, if you can believe it. Oh, I know I just ruined the majesty of those beautiful yellow jackets, but I had to say it. So we turn our attention now from little ermine to wild leopards. And we are looking at another guy in a powdered wig in a suit of armor. So it's the same artist here. It's Nicolas Laudillière. This painting might be familiar. It's in the MFA in Boston, and it is from about 1710. Our focus now is not the wig, but this wonderful sort of mix of textures here between this leopard skin cape, which is sort of draped about his body, and this shiny armor that he's wearing here. And so much is conveyed through these materials, because it's one thing to have a portrait wearing some armor. It's very shiny armor, right? But the leopard skin in this circumstance suggests a worldliness here, suggests the sense that this figure has conquered something, maybe even like a little bit of colonialization here too. But it is there to underscore his status, to also suggest royal connections, and like I said, sort of a worldliness. So there's an implication of sort of like martial skill when we're looking at somebody draped in a leopard skin while also wearing armor. And let's face it, in this context, it is there to make him look absolutely fancy. And I think mission accomplished. Now we're going to turn our attention, to round out this section, to two works that are really all about velvet. We're going to turn our attention back to Marie Antoinette just for a moment. This is a painting from 1788. It's about 9 feet tall. It's in the collection of the New Orleans Museum of Art. And also it was painted by Vigie Lebrun once again. Nowhere near as fancy as that giant court dress that we saw before that she couldn't fit through a door wearing. This was actually considered a loose-fitting gown. It's called robe de la levite, and it was probably made for the queen during her first pregnancy about 7 years prior to this portrait. Now she's wearing an absolutely gorgeous blue velvet dress here with a fur-lined petticoat. Actually, the velvet dress is also lined with fur. So these very warm, kind of sumptuous materials here. And it's worth noting that she's also wearing long sleeves that are kind of loose at the elbow, but fitted at the wrist. Apparently, Marie Antoinette was an avid equestrian. She loved to ride horses, and this was like a style that was kind of associated with riding horses, although it's hard to believe that she would ride in a dress looking like this. Now, it's also worth noting that, that when Marie Antoinette became the Queen of France, there was a tradition that she would get up in the morning and she would actually get dressed in front of all the women of the noble class. They could just be there in her bedroom watching the whole affair. But the way she styled herself, the clothing she wore, how she styled her hair, this was her main form of expression. And so she became very close to a woman named Rose Bertin, who became her fashion designer, her so-called minister of fashion. And Rose Bertin would be like the personal stylist to the queen. She began to dress the queen. They would have these tete-a-tetes about what the queen would wear. And Rose Bertin could earn 20 times what the average French citizen would make in a full year with just one dress design. She would actually take them on the road by creating little doll versions of the dresses and bring them on like little trade shows, basically, to show off what the queen was wearing and what Rose Bertin could do for other people. So this is a great example of her work. Now, the last velvet dress I wanted to share with you, and I think each one of these sections is kind of capped off with a John Singer Sargent. Here we have Mrs. Hugh Hammersley, painted in 1892. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And when this work was first painted, critics at the time referred to it as the apotheosis of fashionable painting. They didn't necessarily mean that as a compliment either, but I think for us, when we look at this, this is a jaw-dropping painting in terms of the technical mastery of suggesting the velvet material that this woman is wearing. This long-sleeved, long red velvet ball gown, or well, an evening dress, I should say, with this long train here, a gossamer collar with a little bit of gold in it that catches the light. And Sargent has used these masterful like mauve brushstrokes to kind of create this crisscross structure, suggesting the way that the velvet would kind of crinkle and really respond to the movement of the sitter here. Now, all of this splendor, which I think we just kind of eat up with a spoon today, critics at the time actually said that the dress was one shade away from being terrible. It's really hard to imagine how anyone could find fault with this other than it being a little bit ostentatious, right? But it is just an absolutely gorgeous expression of velvet here. All right, so now we're going to get a little bit more intimate, turn our attention to silk and satins. And I have to say, I'm such a sucker for this. Any dress that shines, like these two dresses, is just knocks my socks off. So we now turn our attention to these silky, smooth fabrics. And silk and satin are related. Satin is like a textile that's related to silk. In the 1600s, European artists began incorporating it in an increasing degree, these luxurious silk fabrics into their paintings. And if you could do it with any sort of skill, it sort of earned you a career. So we're looking at two paintings by Peter Paul Rubens. Once again, these are both from 1606, and these are two Marquesas from what is present-day Italy. So we can see in both of them women wearing these long silk dresses, sort of tightly woven silk dresses. You can see these tiny crinkles in the one over here on the left, and they've got these big sleeves as well. We'll be talking about rough collars later, even though they kind of steal the show here as well. But here you can see that Peter Paul Rubens has kind of mastered the way that light shines off of and reflects off of these materials. In the different ways that the fabric folds and gathers here, so much so that if you kind of just squint, it's like these pictures are all about the light bouncing off of these dresses, and the dresses themselves almost outshine the subjects here as well. So he's doing something really right. Now, Peter Paul Rubens, he had a student who became a preeminent portrait painter in England, and that was the Flemish Baroque artist Anthony van Dyck. And our next look at silky materials comes to us by way of Van Dyck. This is a double portrait of Lord John Stuart and his brother Bernard, made about 1638. And this is at the National Gallery in London. Truth be told, this painting always makes me chuckle. It is just so over the top. The arrogance, the haughtiness, the peacocking. These boys are actually only 17 and 18 years old, but they just ooze this like aristocratic superiority, and the clothing here is there to underscore that. So they are wearing these contrasting satin doublets and breeches, and they have satin lined capes on as well with these collars and tall boots. Notice that there are hose underneath the boots that also have lace on them that are made to fold over them. Notice that the boots are high heeled. I mean, everything about this is so over the top. So the expensive materials, I'm sure these expensive to craft garments really underscore the very impressive appearance, this elite status that these young men sought to convey with a portrait like this one. You'll never forget this face or this hairdo, right? Now, we're going to turn our attention now to our first religious painting. We don't often associate satin with biblical stories, but here we are. This is a portrayal of Judith and Holofernes by the artist Eglin Hendrik van der Neer from 1678. This is at the National Gallery of Art. Now, if you're not familiar with the story, Judith was a beautiful Jewish widow who saved her people by seducing and then beheading Holofernes. You can see him down here. He was an Assyrian general who was laying siege to her city. So this is a surprisingly bloodless beheading, let's be honest, because the deed has been done. We can see the sword in her hand. There's really like not a drop of blood here. So the emphasis is on the seduction. And I think we're all seduced by a dress that looks like this. All of this satin here, the very tight bodice, these big sort of cuffed sleeves here, banded sleeves, I should say. It's really just a stunning material that you feel like you could reach out and touch. So in the end, van der Neer sort of sacrifices the narrative of the story in order to kind of show off his ability at painting this luxury material. Now we're going to move up through space and time over to France and consider this portrait of the future Madame Monet. This is a painting from 1866 by the preeminent French impressionist Claude Monet, before he found his signature style of these loose broken brushworks. This is a very early painting. He was just 25 years old when he did it. Excuse me for just a moment. So this is a life-size painting of Camille Doncieux, who would become Monet's wife. Sorry, she was 18 years old when this was painted. And I should say that the artist and the muse here were desperately poor at this time, and almost certainly had to borrow a dress that looked this gorgeous. And a little piece of information about this picture that would support that claim is that Monet painted this in just 4 days. So you can imagine somebody said, here, you can use the dress, but I need to have it back in a couple of days. So his treatment of the fabric here, the silk with its hint of stiffness and its kind of gleaming colors contrasted with the warm fur here, it kind of recalls older portraiture, almost like the Vermeer or the Rembrandts that we saw before. But Camille seems kind of convincingly real. She seems like a modern woman. And in fact, this style of skirt, well, at least the contrasting vertical stripes here were very of the moment. So you sort of get the sense that that she's kind of just walking through this space. I mean, he didn't even get to include the full train of the dress. She's walking through, the skirt's kind of moving, it's drawing our eye, and she's paused for a moment, and we just get to see her in this split second here. So maybe we see like the birth of Impressionism here, where he's just focused on a momentary glimpse. But man, he really nailed the silk skirt in this particular painting. We'll wrap up this section with another John Singer Sargent here. This is a portrait of Mrs. Cecil Wade from 1886. This is at the Nelson Atkins Museum. So after the scandal of Madam X, John Singer Sargent went to England to kind of lick his wounds and get started with a whole new set of clients. And Mrs. Cecil Wade here, who's just 23 years old, had actually worn this white satin gown to meet the Queen. So why not don it, sit in it in your living room and act like it's just another Thursday night, right? So this dress is so over the top. We can see that it has this huge sort of section that would normally be behind her, this train here, which occupies like a whole other seat on this bench that she's sitting on. I'm going to mute myself for 1 second because this is a cough. Okay, so we can see this is how Sargent's signature style works so well. There are these bold, virtuoso brushstrokes that kind of resolve themselves when you step away or when you kind of squint your eye, that do such a good job of suggesting the satin here, just a few streaks of white. As you move in a little bit closer, though, you can see some embellishments on the bottom of the dress here that continue all the way up through this tight bodice, all the way up to the choker on her neck. Everything about this dress comes together and effectively conveys the very elevated status of Mrs. Cecil Wade here. Okay, so let's burrow a little deeper now. Let's go beyond the silks and satins and let's delve into some lace and some collars here. We've already seen a few standouts today. Maybe standout is the right term here because, man, these lace collars stand out. Basically, from the 1500s onward, lace becomes a crucial element in depicting wealth and status of a subject. So we begin to see more and more intricate patterns, and we begin to see interesting kind of structure to these lace collars as well. We're looking at two works by the Flemish portrait painter Frans Pourbus the Younger. This work on the left is Elizabeth of France, the Queen of Spain from 1615. This is at the Prado. And on the right, closer to home, we have Isabella Clara Eugenia of Austria, which is at the Gardner Museum, painted about 1600. Now, both of these women are wearing what are called cartwheel ruffs. They're very elaborate. Sometimes they could get up to a foot or more across, I think, in diameter. And you can see that sometimes they were worn sort of tilted up. So again, they're kind of creating the silhouette around the face. And in a portrait like Isabella Clara Eugenia's over here, we can see that that in order to achieve an angle like that, sometimes artists, well, I should say sometimes the lace makers would actually have to include some additional wire architecture in order to support a very wide ruff like this. Now, these were highly starched lace ruffs. They would be separate from a dress. They would go to a special launderer who would clean them and then starch them. Everything about these women's clothes look so spiky and so uncomfortable. I just had to include this painting from the Gardner because she looks not at all pleased to be wearing such uncomfortable clothes. It looks like its own form of armor, doesn't it? So, a highly starched lace collar like this would have been something that only the richest could afford because it was so impractical to wear. Imagine not being able to see your feet. Imagine trying to navigate through tight spaces. This was a difficult one. So if women weren't wearing the big hoop skirts, it's, you know, something around their necks. Now, if you think that this looks like a stiff collar, hold on to your socks, because now we are looking at the only sculpture in today's program. This is a marble bust of Maria Barberini, done by the artist Giuliano Finelli in 1627. He was an apprentice to the Baroque sculptor Bernini. You probably heard that name before. So this is what's known as a Marie de Medici style lace collar, where it's very tall and stiff in the back, and then it opens up, sort of frames the face, and comes down flat in the front. Now, as a marble sculpture, it is just jaw-dropping, mind-boggling to think that someone using just a hammer and a chisel could not only create the pattern here, this very delicate pattern, but to create all of these tiny holes in very thin marble without breaking off full sections of it, without the aid of a computer or any sort of machine. This is all done by hand, and it really is just spectacular. And as it turns out, marble might be the best material to do this in, because these starch collars were just so stiff, right? So a work that's just done to spectacular effect here. Now, we're going to turn our attention to an evolution of the collar. And we're looking at another Rembrandt painting here. Things are softening up a little bit, aren't they? So now we're in the Dutch Baroque, and this is what's called a fallen collar, or slightly fallen collar. This is Rembrandt's portrait of Johannes Utenberg. And he was apparently sort of a combative preacher who would only sit for Rembrandt for just one day. So Rembrandt did something really smart. He used that time to just paint this man's face, and then he used this rough collar here to emphasize this man's face. So everything else is really black. It's, it's just essentially this black mass here. And then we are invited to look closer to the flesh of this man's skin, to the hair of his beard, and then appreciate the delicacy of this collar that so beautifully frames his face. So it creates this wonderful contrast with the dark tones of the picture, and it gives us a sense of the architecture of this type of collar. There's usually like an accordion fold or a figure-8 fold for a slightly fallen rough collar like this. It would have required yards and yards and yards of fabric in order to create something that is this intricate. Now, over time, even the slightly fallen rough collar becomes totally flat. So we're looking at another painting by Anthony van Dyck. This one's from 1636, and this is a triple portrait of Charles I, the King of England. And notice in this triple portrait that he's actually wearing different garments in each of these paintings. So what we can see here is that he is wearing what's called a flat lace collar, and there is a different pattern painted in each one of these. You can see, like, for instance, a little insect painted here. Over in this collar, there's some flowers. There's like a floral motif. Now, a flat collar like this one allows for something new. Men can have longer hair now. It doesn't sort of interrupt or pool on a fancy collar. And in this case, Charles I actually was sporting the style that one side of his hair is much longer than the other side of his hair. Interesting, right? But the collar kind of calls attention to it. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth did he create this sort of strange huddle of one? It kind of reminds me of going into like a dressing room where you can see yourself in multiple mirrors at the same time. And that was sort of the desired effect. In fact, this was a painting that was done for the benefit of a sculptor, the sculptor Bernini, who was going to carve a portrait bust of the king and needed to be able to see him in as many perspectives as possible. So we have the profile, we have frontal, and we have three-quarter profile over here. So unfortunately, the portrait bust that was carved no longer survives. It was in a fire. So we can only imagine how spectacular that was. So pleased that we still have this fascinating and strange portrait as evidence of it. So we round out this section with two more John Singer Sargent paintings. In this case, two works that are about lace, and they almost seem to like encapsulate this whole history that we just reviewed. We have Winifred, the Duchess of Portland, over here from 1902, and then Mrs. Leopold Hirsch from 1902 as well. I believe these are both in private collections, so you don't see them as often. Now, the Duchess over here is wearing this long silk gown. She's got this red mantle over it. She's as statuesque as like this Ionic column behind her. And her lovely long neck and face are framed by this stiff Marie de Medici style collar. And in this case, we don't have Sargent sort of slavishly trying to capture the details of the lace. He renders it in like this flurry of almost like impressionistic brushstrokes here, but we get the sense of the materials, we get the sense of the stiffness of it. It achieves its goal. He does this so well, but he kind of has a different aim for this next subject over here on the right, because Mrs. Hirsch was a collector of antique textiles. So the particular lace pattern, the brocade pattern was all probably pretty important to her. So we see that Sargent is really taking his time. She's wearing this very low cut dress, and then it's almost like a fallen collar or flat collar here. And it extends from the neckline almost down to her waist or her elbow here. So there's a particular pattern that Sargent is very carefully trying to render. And as your eyes move down, you can see that there's even like a lace overlay that is underneath the pink brocade here. So lots of detail in that particular painting. So in both of these works, we can see that Sargent, styling his subjects, has kind of taken what's old and made it new again, in the wonderful way that he has, right? All right, so as we finish up, I believe this is one of our last sections here, our last section, ribbons, ruffles, and frills. Now we're really getting into like the underlayers, right? And we're going to start off with this iconic Rococo painting from the 18th century, where we see a resurgence of popularity with ruffles and ribbons and frills in 18th century, in European fashion, I should say. This is the world famous painting, The Swing by Jean-Honoré Fragonard, painted in 1767. This is at the Wallace Collection in London. And this is a depiction of this tiny woman in this sumptuously ruffled peach pink garment, this gown, rising high on this swing in this private wooded setting. Notice the wall in the background. And it's just worth noting too that swinging, this activity, was one of the few kind of sanctioned activities of the nobility, a leisure time activity that's also kind of vigorous too, but its associations with the active sex were very well known. It's like this rhythmic activity, it quickens your heart. So already the subject here that Fragonard has picked is already one that's like a little bit naughty. And he's made it even naughtier because, of course, the woman on the swing is kicking off her tiny little shoe and spreading her legs open wide so that her lover down below can peek up that incredible skirt of hers. So the entire effect here is very soft. It's very curvilinear, it's private, it's intimate. Notice that the hem of her dress creates this beautiful kind of undulating line that rises up to where her leg is, very similar to the undulating line of the tree up above her. We're going to zoom in on the dress for just a moment because it is such a knockout of a dress and such an unbelievable and creative way to imagine painting a dress as well. So he freezes this dress in midair just as it's opening up like this flower to reveal the wonderful layers and structure of what's known as a robe à la française. So there are multiple layers of frilly lace at her elbows. There's a lace, what's called a stomacher here that she's wearing. We can see that there's a ruffle at the hemline as well, and then even a ribbon at her throat here. The whole painting is this brilliant, very titillating way of presenting fashionable dress from the day. But is there anyone who is more fashionable than Madame de Pompadour? Here she is in her iconic green dress, painted right around the same time by the artist Francois Boucher. Now, she was the beautiful mistress of King Louis XV of France, and she was the ultimate influencer. What she wore, what she read, she was always just trying to make the world a more beautiful place. At least that's what she claimed. And it seems as though she aimed to do that through her fashion choices. This is a dress that the kids today would call being very extra. It's just so over the top. This is a green silk robe a la Française with a matching petticoat. We think of petticoats being something completely hidden underneath the dress. The French would refer to it as essentially the skirt of a dress that was visible. All of it is adorned with these little pink roses, which tells us that this dress is a very tightly woven silk called taffeta. If it was just a regular silk dress, it wouldn't have been able to support all of this embellishment without fraying. Silk itself is just a little too fragile for that. If we zoom in here, we can see that the stomacher that Madame de Pompadour is wearing is made up of these pink bows that go from large to small. And if you have really good eyes, they have contrasting green stripes on them to coordinate with the dress itself. This stomacher is like a brand new fashion statement by Madame de Pompadour. It was called an échelle, and great way to sort of pinch in a tiny little waist, right? We notice that there are coordinating ribbons at her elbows and 1, 2, 3 layers of lace, and then maybe 2 extra layers of decorative frills at her elbows. We see another ribbon at her throat and real flowers in her hair and at the corsage. This is so over the top in terms of its decoration. It's soft, it's frilly, it's feminine, but the ultimate question for each one of us, right, is, was it comfortable? That's a whole different story, and it actually brings us back to Marie Antoinette just for another second. We've seen the Queen, and each time we've seen her, she's gotten more and more casual, right? This is another painting by Vigée Lebrun, the famous painting of the Queen in her underwear, so-called. This became known as a robe, a chemise à la reine, because which essentially refers to like a chemise dress or chemise frock like this one, à la reine, a la the Queen. What we see here is the Queen wearing such a simple garment here, very similar to the kind of base garment that many women wore under their nice dresses. This was considered way too informal for a monarch to wear. This particular painting had to be taken off view. It was so unpopular. Even still, it created a real sort of trend in fashion. It was a trend that was already happening, but the Queen made this trend, set it in concrete. And we can see that in subsequent years, women were wearing very similar fashions, simple frocks, relatively simple frocks, adorned with ribbons and sashes. This is another Vigée Lebrun painting of Madame Grande. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, painted the same year as the Queen. And we can see a relatively simple gown, but this emphasis on these blue silk ribbons at the bust, at the waist, in her hair, and they punctuate the picture in such a gorgeous way. We can also see over here on the right a picture by the artist Antoine Vestier from about 2 years after the Queen was painted. The dress is similar in so many ways, but just elevated a little bit. It has this ribbon pattern to it, and the way the artist here has described the silk blue sash at the waist and in her hair, it is just a knockout of a painting. So we wrap up tonight with one last incredible ribbon and sash. And of course, it's from John Singer Sargent. This one is a favorite for me, and I think so many. This is Lady Agnew of Lochna, painted in 1892. It's part of the National Gallery of Scotland. Lady Agnew's direct gaze here and informal pose, I think, immediately pull us in. And her style of dress really emphasizes this relaxed, confident appearance that she has. Sargent does such a great job of describing this field of chiffon at the front of the picture in the foreground. It kind of pulls us in. And then there's this incredible lilac sash that he describes with just a few brush strokes here. It emphasizes her tiny waist, brings our eye up to the chiffon ruffle around her neckline, these transparent sleeves with additional ribbons here. The whole look is the very essence of chic and confidence. It's a beautiful dress that Sargent renders just absolutely even more beautiful with his virtuoso brushwork. So I realize I'm way over time here. We'll just do the quickest conclusion. And we have this great series of images here to show us kind of how far we've come. We've considered a wide and wild variety of fashions through the years this evening. So many fine materials and just remarkable skill from artists that captured them. Hopefully, today's program has given you a better sense of the changing styles through the centuries and the great artists that immortalize them. So I thank you for your time and attention. I'm sorry we went so long. I'll start looking at the Q&A now. Joe says, upcoming webinars with Jane. Let's see, Joe, if you would like a copy of any of the slides, please feel free to be in touch with me at my website, which is iamculturallycurious.com. And you can also find other free programs like this on the calendar page of my website. Next month, I'll be doing a program for Chelmsford, Groton, Tewkesbury, and Amesbury, and that will be on Rembrandt and Vermeer. Miro says, I thought a flower in the hand hanging downward was to depict a dead person, and the Marie Antoinette portrait has it in this way. Muriel, I've actually never heard that before, but let's go back to it and see what we can find. I have a feeling you might have written this for the velvet picture here. Nope, maybe that was the very first one. Huh. Well, she was very young here. At this point, she hadn't lost any of her children. So I'm not sure if that is true to this painting. That's a fascinating theory, and I really haven't heard that before, but I kind of like it. So we're going to have to explore that a little bit more. Let's see, Helen. Oh, Helen, thanks for being here. She said, do the artists often paint the subjects to make them better looking in the work than they actually look in real life? Ooh, Helen, that is always the challenge with a portrait. Certainly true with Vigie Lebrun and Marie Antoinette. She certainly softened some of those features. We could see that Rembrandt was a master, I think, in pleasing the features, even, the wrinkles, the folds of a face. So I think the expectation was to make them look as the very best they could, but also look recognizable. Let's see. Somebody asked if I have seen Isabelle de Borchgrave. I don't think I have. Thanks for adding that. I guess she does paper dress exhibits. I'm going to have to look into that. Mary Zoll asks, if Marie Antoinette posed in her underwear, why on earth did she wear such a huge hat? Great question, going back to that picture. So it wasn't officially her underwear, I should say. It was a very informal casual gown with like the gathered sleeves here that was very similar and the same kind of material that was used for a base garment at the time. So it was already kind of popular for women to have this kind of au naturel look. So the straw hat was kind of similar in style and, a simple sash around, your natural waist here. This was all the style for the time. But you bring up a great question, Mary, so thanks for asking it. Ron says, these works of art have brought us today's marriage of art and fashion, the Met Gala. Yes, doesn't that just seem like the like the natural successor to all of this, right? And someone else asked, what was the hat in the Rembrandt with the gold chain made of? I think that that was a velvet hat. That's at least what it looks like to me. That style of hat is generally just known as a Renaissance hat, and they weren't necessarily always made with the same material. But to me, the cloak looks like it's velvet. The hat looks like it's velvet. It feels like you could reach out and touch it. Great question. Joe, oh, yeah, I think I got to Joe's questions. Let's see in the chat. Let's see here. Oh, very kind words, everybody in the chat. I really appreciate it. I'm not going to read them all out loud because my head will get too big, but I am going to copy and paste them for later. Oh, and Beth says, did women dye their hair when these paintings were done? I remember hearing women were dyeing their hair at least as far back as the Renaissance, if not earlier. So yes, sometimes some of these cases we are probably seeing depictions of women with dyed hair. Um, Adair, thanks for your kind words. I love that you'll look at art and fashion differently now. That's so sweet. And Theo says, love the Sargent painting of the Isabel Stewart Gardner. The black dress, the tiny waist, very similar to the Madame X painting that we looked at. And Theo, I know and love that dress so well. In fact, it's part of my slate of programs for next year. April's program is going to be just on the works at the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum. So we will delve into that one. That one was a whole fashion scandal of the day too. I used to give tours at the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum. So it's near and dear to my heart. Thanks for bringing it up. Fredessa, let's see. I'm glad people had fun with this. Thank you so much for your kind words. Thanks for sticking around for an extra long time. Sorry I took so long. I think we got to everything. As always, if you have any questions, criticisms, comments, feedback for me, please feel free to get in touch with me on my website, which is iamculturallycurious.com. And there's plenty of ways to contact me on the website. Thank you so much for spending your evening with me. I look forward to seeing your names at least soon. And certainly next month, it's November 21st, a little bit early. So we only have about 3 weeks between now and then. And then we'll be diving right into Rembrandt and Vermeer. So thank you again, everybody. Have a great night, and I will see you soon. Take care.